Hi everybody, this is June 11th, 2025, and this video is part of a video journal in my recovery from the trauma of watching my little brother, Paul Kierans, 64, with Down syndrome, be locked up by the British Columbia New Democratic Party government with David Eby as leader. Paul was locked up on September 10th of 2022 after I complained to the Burnaby RCMP about what I believe are alleged to be a fraudulent and forged power of attorney that the government created to give Paul the COVID-19 shot. They appointed my 82-year-old Catholic nun sister 4,000 kilometers away in Ontario as Paul's guardian to make all decisions about him. Paul never had a lawyer. He was never allowed to speak with a lawyer. And they didn't even have a notary witness the power of attorney. They had two low-level workers at their L'Arche group home. So this is, I believe, the worst miscarriage of justice in Canadian history, of which there are many. Paul was locked up for 588 days with no visits. The government, through the L'Arche group home lawyer, ordered the nun to terminate all my visits with my little brother. The lawyer wrote me and she said, her name is Tara Britnell at Hamilton Duncan Law Firm. She wrote me and she said, "You'll never see your brother again." So at that point, Paul and I had been able to visit at will for 64 years. I remember when he was brought home from the hospital. So I've been posting these videos because there is, as a form of working through the trauma of watching Paul be locked up and then die. I believe he was killed right in front of me. And a friend of mine has said that I should try and be clear about the circumstances of his confinement, and then I believe he was murdered. So, as I said, I complained to the Burnaby RCMP in August of 2022 about the fraudulent and forged power of attorney, and the constable that I spoke to said that she would get a search warrant for the original document, the original power of attorney, and interview the government witnesses. She didn't do that. What she did was she just went to the government and warned them that I had complained, and the same day they terminated my visits with Paul. And I fought to the Supreme Court of Canada twice to try and restore Paul's visits with me. The evil lawyer who worked for the government and for L'Arche said that I could have a 10-minute telephone call with Paul. The reason they allowed a 10-minute telephone, she wouldn't even allow a virtual visit because I had alleged that Paul was too low functioning to appoint a guardian. He didn't have the mental capability of choosing a guardian. And if he had, he would never have picked an 82-year-old nun who he had only met a few times in his life. Anyways, so Paul, I complained to the Burnaby RCMP, and they tipped off, they didn't investigate at all, they just tipped off the government who pays them that I had complained, and the government terminated my visits with Paul. And I'd been to the Supreme Court of Canada twice. As I said, I was never given permission to appeal. You have to go to the Supreme Court of Canada, you have to be granted leave to appeal. And I always got the same judge at the Supreme Court of Canada, Suzanne Cote. Suzanne Cote most recently worked, I practiced as a lawyer for 23 years, and Suzanne Cote worked for a law firm that I was in a fee dispute over. They had done some legal work for me when I was a lawyer. And I could never get anybody else to review my applications for leave to appeal. So I was allowed a 10-minute telephone call with Paul once a week on Friday afternoon. they didn't want me to meet with him in person because then I could have him tested to show he was too low functioning to grant a power of attorney or appoint a representative. And I could also get an authentic copy of his signature. So the last appeal that I had that was dismissed, we got the decision on March 28th of 2024, and Paul was dead 26 days later on March 13th. I'm sorry, on April 13th. He had some kind of brain incident. And I got an email from the evil nun's lawyer. She had 3 law firms working for her, 1 in Ottawa and 2 in Vancouver, paid for by the Catholic Church, of which I'm a member. So her lawyer emailed me at about 8:15 on April 15th, 2 days after Paul had this stroke. And he said, Paul's had a stroke. You can arrange a visit through me. So I dropped everything and I took a cab to the hospital. And when I was in the cab, I was so discombobulated that I wasn't able to get money out of I went to a cash machine to get cash to pay the cab. I don't know why, I just didn't use my bank card, but anyways, I was so stressed out I couldn't get the money out of the bank machine. So I asked the cab driver if he would just accept. All I had on me was $20 cash, and I said, would he accept that? So he said, okay. And I asked the cab driver, I asked him to say a prayer for my brother. I said, my brother's just had a stroke. He's at Burnaby General. Can you say a prayer? I said, are you Punjabi? And are you Sikh? He said, no, I'm Hindi. And so I said, can you say a prayer in Hindi for my brother? He said he would. And I prayed all the way. When I got to see Paul, I was allowed to see him for 10 minutes at the hospital. And I said, Paul, it's Kathleen. And he was on a ventilator. He had oxygen mask and a ventilator. He was all hooked up to a ventilator. And his eyes didn't open, but he squeezed my hand like he'd never squeezed it before. When I said my name, it was like a steel vice. And he just held on so tight to my hand. And that was the first time I had seen him in 588 days. This David Eby, remember that, David Eby, locked up Paul for 588 days. I'm his last surviving family member from a big family of 6 adult children and my mother. I was the last one. But Paul was locked away in his L'Arche group home. Never, ever allow your loved one to be placed in a group home, particularly a L'Arche group home. That's L'Arche. Believe it or not, I mean, truth is stranger than fiction. L'Arche was started as an SCX cult for a retired Canadian naval officer and a defrocked French priest. And they started these group homes all around the world so that they could prey on the young immigrant women they would hire to work there. Anyways, so when I arrived at the hospital, I was allowed to visit with Paul for 10 minutes, and then I had to leave. And then for the next 10 days, Paul survived for 10 days. And I went every day, and I stayed there all day, from 7 in the morning till 10 at night when the last bus. But I was only allowed by the evil nun 10 minutes. At one point, Burnaby General had a male nurse who pretended to be a doctor, take me in a back room and say that if I made any problems, they would call the police. And I myself called the police when they wouldn't let me visit him. I just said, interview him. But they wouldn't. I said, interview him without the nun in the room, but they wouldn't do that. It was a nightmare. But Paul miraculously seemed to be recovering. He had a wound on the side of his head that was oozing blood. I asked my sister, what is that? But she never told me. They said he had a stroke. but he seemed to be recovering. And a neighbor gave me a gift for him, a big coffee table book with pictures of movie stars, and I brought it to him, and he grabbed it from my hand. He sat up, grabbed the book from my hand, and started turning the pages perfectly. So the nun went to her Vancouver lawyers the next day and spent the whole day at the Vancouver lawyers swearing an affidavit saying that my brother didn't turn the pages as I had said. I'd posted a little post here on Facebook. Then I got a call from the Burnaby RCMP on about 6:30 on Sunday, April 21st. And the RCMP told me they had been ordered by Ottawa. There's an Ottawa, the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP is an Ottawa agency that oversees complaints about conduct by police officers, and they had ordered the Burnaby RCMP to reopen the investigation into the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. And the police officer that called me, the staff sergeant that called me, told me about this, and he emailed me the letter confirming it, but the letter was a month old. So the letter telling me they were going to reopen the investigation into the fraudulent and forged power of attorney was a month old. So what I believe happened is again, the Burnaby RCMP tipped off the evil nun, her lawyer, and the British Columbia government about what was happening and that they had been ordered to reopen the investigation. So they always went to the wrongdoers, the crooks, and tipped them off before they told me. And I went to the court the next morning. Well, I had court the next morning to try and reinstate my visits with Paul. And I prepared an affidavit explaining what I've just told you. And when I got back to the hospital, I didn't get the visits. Actually, what I wanted to have happen was to have the Minister of Children and the Ministry of Children and Family Affairs take over as Paul's guardian instead of the evil nun, because I knew she was going to kill him. Once the police were involved, I knew he had to die. And when I got back to the hospital, Paul's ventilator had been removed and he appeared to me to be sedated to death. And I got an email from the evil nuns the next day saying that he had died, but they would hold his body till 2:30 so I could come and look at it. So I complained to the coroner, the British Columbia coroner, and they said because the doctor, the treating physician at Burnaby General had signed off on the death certificate, there was nothing they could do. So I complained about that doctor. And that's where things stand now. So once this is a sort of an important part of the chronology, is that what the Burnaby RCMP did once they were ordered by Ottawa to reopen the investigation into the fraudulent and forged power of attorney, they tipped off the government and they tipped off the evil nun. And so her lawyers applied to the court to have me declared a vexatious litigant. So that's a special, rare, and unusual designation that takes away all of your civil rights. So if somebody sues you, you can't respond without permission from the court. And you can't sue anybody. You cannot do anything in court. And then Paul died, and they went ahead. And although they said the hearing was going to be 30 minutes, they were allowed by the judge hearing them to go on for 2 half days and 2 full days. And even in the face of, I had a heart attack in 2016. I have lupus. I've almost died from kidney failure. And I told the judge I'm not allowed. I have medical certificate saying I'm not allowed to be in court for longer than 2 hours per day. But she went ahead. She went ahead 2.5 hours on the first 2 days, and then for 4 hours, full days on the second 2 days. And then, of course, she declared me a vexatious litigant in my absence. So my appeal, I prepared the appeal of her decision, and the appeal is taking place at 2 o'clock on June, coming up in 13 days, on June 24th at 2 p.m. And you can watch it by clicking on the British Columbia Court of Appeal website. On the hearing, there's a hearing tab, and you can click on that and watch it virtually. Better still, you can come down and support me. You can come down to 800 Smythe Street. It should be very interesting. Come down to 800 Smythe Street, and you can sit in the courtroom. And judges do take note of the interest, the community interest. I've tried to contact every media outlet. People say, oh, why don't you contact the CBC or the CTV? No, because this is the government. It's me against the government, and we all know in Canada the media is controlled by the government. There was a woman with Down syndrome. Paul had Down syndrome. And there was a 54-year-old woman with Down syndrome was starved to death in 2018. The coroner's jury found that her death was a homicide by starvation while she was in the care of the same government agency that had locked Paul away for 588 days before he died. So please come down to 800 Smythe Street between Howe and Hornby in Vancouver and come up to the courtroom. It should be very interesting. I put in about 1,000 hours of work, and I've spent every penny that I have. I borrowed $12,000 so that I could hire psychiatrists, experts, to say that Paul would benefit from visits with me. But no, I could never get a judge to permit him to be examined by experts. As I said, this is the worst miscarriage of justice in Canadian history, of which we have a long string of terrible miscarriages of justice. For all the money that we spend on the judicial system, we have horrific examples of miscarriages of justice. Anyways, that's it for now. Please mark in your calendar right now, stop and mark in your calendar, Tuesday, June 24th at 2 p.m. to watch my appeal hearing, or come down to 800 Smythe Street. I love you all. Take care, everybody.